Thanks a lot for everyone for joining in. So my name is Aki, and I've been doing machine learning for the last 10 plus years. Been sort of leading AI engineering at a financial services firm before. Been in the academia as well, working on doing ML for, especially in the healthcare sector. And now sort of moved on to building my own consultancy firm that does AI consultancy work for sort of mid to sort of large tier firms in North America and Europe. So that's my sort of background. And we build a lot of agents for a lot of clients, and we see that sometimes you don't have to build an agent, because of the hype. A lot of sort of from a C-suite, you get these instructions. Can you sort of apply agents for this problem? But I think that's not the right way to sort of think about this. And I think like we'll sort of look at this. Today's session is about sort of thinking about this in a more methodical way, when to sort of use an agent and when to sort of a workflow, etc. So today's agenda is very simple. We're going to talk about what are AI agents, a quick introduction, and then we go into a framework called DAI framework, which is sort of a guide and a step-by-step process for you to think about how to sort of decide um, to decide between how to sort of come up with the architecture that is needed for your AI solution. So that's what their framework is. This is generated from sort of looking at all these examples throughout with my work in the last 10 plus years. And at the end, we got some time for Q&A. So I think if you look at the sort of the core problem is because um, a lot of folks sort of thinking, sort of looking at some of the agents doing really great work, sort of jump into building agents. So sometimes agents are not the right answer for every problem because they can be fragile, can be really expensive, and sometimes hard to debug. If you don't have the right kind of observability in place, it's relatively hard to sort of debug. And As I mentioned earlier, most of the use cases don't need this level of autonomy, and you can define like right kind of workflow to get that done. So the rule of thumb is like um, before building an agent, just ask yourself, does this system need to decide or just execute? So that's going to help you sort of think about sort of the type of sort of workflow, the architecture that you need to build. So that's like a rule of thumb that I sort of follow. So before we jump into the framework, it's important to sort of define what an AI agent means. This word is thrown around a lot by different folks, and there are different definitions. For our sort of use case, we're going to talk sort of consider AI agents as these LLM-powered systems that can autonomously plan and take actions, and they do this by using tools, which could be different types of services, different type of integrations, and based on the feedback from the environment. So you do have this observability loop where you sort of keep track of what's happening and you get feedback from the environment and see if the agent could finish its task. And then depending on that, you sort of replan and sort of take more actions. So that's what an AI agent means. This is very similar to biological agents where you sort of like you have a brain, you have tools, like it could be if it's a human, like you have legs and hands, and you use them to sort of do certain things, and you have sort of feedback loop through sensory organs, and you sort of like make sure to sort of like reevaluate your actions to get to your goal. So AI agents are the synthetic version of that, and this is the definition we are going to use today. So how do we decide? I think like that's the main question, right? So how do we decide between a workflow and agent or a mix of both? Um, so for that, like there's framework called DAI framework, which sort of helps you think about this decision. So these stand for determinism. So you sort of think about like how predictable and rule-based the system's behavior is. Does your sort of solution needs to be predictable, or can it sort of change from time to time? So that's the first sort of thing you need to decide. And then you have autonomy, A, which is like, can this system sort of take actions without the human feedback? So like areas like healthcare, this might be a bit of a risky thing to do to run it autonomously. And then the risk aspect, like if something goes wrong, what are the potential sort of implication of that, like the cost and the potential um, the damage for human health, etc. So there's massive risk involved with it. So that's what R stands for. And then there's the evaluation. Can you sort of measure and sort of figure out if the system is working properly? Can you put right kind of evals in place so that you can have a health check of your system as it runs with time? So those are the four sort of areas in this framework, and sort of answering them step by step is going to help you decide like, okay, what is the right way to sort of approach deciding between agents versus um, general workflows. So workflow, I define sort of agents, but the workflow is like relatively something deterministic. For example, it could be general sequence of events that does a specific business process, and it may have loops, it may have conditions, but still it is a deterministic path. So you know, depending on the input, how it's going to get executed. So that's um, the opposite type of architecture for a agent or a multi-agent system. Cool. So like we'll now go through uh, each sort of sec like the part of the framework and see how that sort of impacts with an example. So determinism. So the first question you should ask is like, are these steps that in your business process are predictable? So if it is, so which is a workflow that we need to build. So generally, you'll see these kind of sort of features. So steps are known upfront for a given input, same output, very deterministic, and the flow can be fully specified. So even though it may have sort of like these loops, it could have conditional branches. It doesn't matter. The workflow can be sort of planned out, mapped out, and you should know how that's going to work. An agent, as opposed to that. So steps vary by the input. So and depending on the input, different steps can be taken, and the system must decide like what happens next. You can't necessarily sort of cover all the cases where you can't write like very sophisticated workflows, and the flow cannot be predefined, so it will be very hard to define like what sort of path it's going to take. So if it can be defined like that, that should be a workflow rather than agent. So that's the first thing you need to think about, whether the determinism aspect of your sort of solution. So this is one example. So if you look at this, this is like a OCR process where you have some sort of invoice that you need to sort of extract information from an invoice. We use like OCR, object character recognition, where you sort of like run it through an LLM extraction process and you extract the information from the document. And after that, you do a schema validation to check if the right kind of information and the right kind of the structure of the document is there, and you have a confidence check. So depending on that, you do a human review. So somebody would actually check if the information is correct, and if needs to be corrected, they'll do adjustments and store that information. So this is, even though there's a LLM in the workflow, it is not autonomous. So this is a structured workflow. These steps are known, and humans are also involved in this process. So this is like a really good example of a workflow with AI in it. So the question is like, why not an agent, right? So you have like similar type of input that's coming in. It's a sort of a document or a invoice, or depending on the problem, you have a repetitive input that's coming in. Structure imports, structure matters a lot. So because like schema validation is in place, so you want to make sure the right kind of information is there, and also it has an auditing aspect, because like you need to make sure that these information are checked and also sort of stored in a way that you can sort of look back, check back, so you have some audit logs as well. So that's the sort of the structure of this problem. So because of that, it's very hard for us to make this an agentic workflow. It doesn't make sense as well from a financial point of view to make this an agentic process. So this is like a really good example of using the determinism, sort of the dimension and the angle, to decide whether you want to do a workflow as opposed to an agent. Yeah. So the next step is autonomy, which is thinking about the is autonomy actually required? Sometimes you might not need that. So you should use an agent only if your system like needs to pick tools dynamically. So tools means that different kinds of external services that you need to sort of call. So like could be APIs, could be some sort of a specialized service that you may have, like for example, sort of a math calculation tool, like could be some sort of a knowledge base query that we need to make, so stuff like that. So does the system needs to make these kind of calls in a dynamic way, so that you can't plan ahead. So that's one thing. And you might need to sort of like replan mid execution, so that like depending on the information we gather from the feedback loop, we might need to replan middle of the execution. And like we might need to ask follow-up questions from the user. And also if there are situations where it's like we need to operate under missing and conflicting information, so that you need to reason about. So there's some of the reasons that you may use an agentic system. Could be a multi-agent system or a single agent. Like whatever it is, you probably need to sort of fulfill some of these steps. But even though you may have an LLM in place, like as we looked at in the previous slide, and you probably might be doing known set of steps like extracting, summarizing, and classifying. So if you have like known set of steps and you know how this is going to flow, this is still a workflow. It doesn't matter, even though you have an sort of reasoning model in place, unless you have written it, unless you have these sort of requirements within the problem. So you don't have to sort of build an agent. So you can still get away with building a workflow, and that's the smarter way to sort of handle this. That's the angle about autonomy. And if you look at an example, um, uh, let's take like a vendor research agent. Like we have to do analysis about like set of vendors, and you need to do research. Like in the past, a human would have done this and go through Google and sort of pull certain information and sort of summarize and sort of provide that information to the stakeholders that's needed to use this data. But right now, this is like a great option for an agent. It's because like you have an open-ended goal. This query could be of any type of a vendor and like certain information about a vendor, and we don't know like how to sort of complete this yet. Like what sort of information to pull, depending on the sort of area of depending on the question that you get. And you need to do tool selection, because sometimes you need to search to databases, you need to search on the web, sometimes you need to search from internal documents. So there's a lot of like tool coding that needs to happen. And this, by definition, this is an exploratory task. So you need to like explore and try out different things to get the right kind of information. So like research agents are in general like a really good example of like research assistants in general. It's a really good example of having agentic architecture. So if you look at like things like Perplexity, even deep research, so these are like really good examples where you can let the agent run well, and you may have some limitations around the number of loops that it can run, but at the end of the day, it is going to be ideally an agent rather than a structured sort of a workflow. So this is like an example about autonomy and making use of that decision to come up with the architecture. Um, the third one is risk. So this is quite straightforward. So like what is the cost of being wrong, right? So depending on the risk level, you can decide what's the architecture. Relatively simple. If the risk level is super high, like from a financial point of view, from a trust compliance and legal point of view, definitely think about building a workflow rather than going with an agent. If the risk level is medium, let's say maybe there's financial element to it, but that's it, and the upside is so much high. So if that's the case, still I would go with a workflow with a set of guardrails. So you can sort of try and sort of integrate a bit more LLMs into the mix, but definitely I wouldn't go full blown agent yet. But if you look at like the risk level is been super low, like research tools, internal draft, sort of drafting, sort of tool that helps you like researchers come up with certain outputs, initial drafts, any type of thing that we can have like a human in the loop, but probably internal or like some sort of low risk area. It's good to sort of think about an agent. So one famous situation that happened like when uh, like maybe 2 3 years ago when like one of the leading Canadian sort of firms airlines sort of like had a chatbot and sort of it sort of promised like some extravagant amount of like refunds that's gonna do and say like, okay, we'll do it because like the airline did something wrong, but it was like by mistake it's hallucinated and it's promised something that it shouldn't do, but the issue is that it's legally binding because it's an external sort of like a tool that was provided by the service provider for a customer, and they have sort of like, yeah, they got sued and paid like a lot of money for that. So it's very important to consider risks, and then depending on where you deploy it, like if it is something like customer facing, you really need to either define your terms and conditions. Either you need to be very cautious about like how to sort of roll this out, and you'll see this a lot with like the big tech firms. Like when they start rolling out different kinds of tools, they really have to analyze cost and cost implication, like the risk implication of sort of using this. Uh, Good question. So Santiago's question is the relationship between risk level and choosing an agent versus a workflow primarily driven by the need for human oversight or intervention? Not necessarily. I think like Santiago, I'll come to this in a bit. Like so this is, we definitely need to sort of look at multiple aspects. Like sometimes, like if you look at like a research agent, might not need a human intervention. I mean, obviously, human will consume that, but you may not need a human intervention to check that. So I think it depends on where it is deployed, like the risk aspect. So there are like multiple sort of dimensions at play, right? So I'll sort of show like a summary of this that will sort of explain how to think about this. Yeah. So this is like example regarding risk. So let's say a weekly metrics report in a business where you have to sort of like pull out information from SQL sort of tables and do some calculations and send an email. So you can have like LLM in the loop where you do some LLM based analysis, which is awesome, like because you have like this fixed like repetitive and like this predictive output that's coming from SQL, and you do a bit of calculations, could be a script, and then use that data to run a narrative on top of that. And this is um, like a workflow, but with a mix of LLM. But we can't let this run as an agent because if you let it run as like a fully autonomous agent, it needs to decide like the types of metrics to pull, the types of SQL to do. Unless you have the right kind of guardrails, it's becomes a really messy system because it's unnecessary as well, right? So something like this, definitely use a workflow. Obviously, you can tap in like sort of add on like LLMs in the mix. It's going to add more value, but from architecture point of view, it should be an agent, because so reproducibility is super important for these kind of things, because like the decision makers would use this data to make certain decisions, and they might need to come back and revisit and like sort of go through why they made that decision. So it's super important that you have this in a more reproducible manner, and you can't have like variability as well. So you need to be all the time, depending on the parameters that you use to generate this report, it needs to be the same all the time. So you can't change it. So this is like example of the risk, because like the risk, especially from financial and legal point of view, it's super high to using agents in this case. So yeah. So the last one is sort of the evaluation side of things, where can this be tested and observed? It's like, especially if you are deploying agents, you need to ask these questions like, can we define success? Is it possible to detect loops? Like especially within agents, they go in loops, and if you don't know a loop when a loop is happening, you're gonna like ink a lot of cost. So you need to like try and like, yeah, detect if that's happening. Can we replay outputs? Like, can we sort of observe that? So line is like a good example for this. You can keep track of the agent's behavior, and you can see where in which places you sort of like the interaction between different agents, and what sort of LLM calls are made, what were the outputs. So the replay is super important. And can you explain failures? Like if something breaks, can you sort of like look at the logs and figure out like what's the issue? So if this is not like, most of these are not true, it's a good sign. You shouldn't sort of try to ship sort of agents, especially in a sort of a critical medium level risk category. So Evaluation aspect is super important. So this is one example um, where you would be sort of doing a um, what's it? You'll be doing a sort of a hybrid sort of a product where you have partially it's a workflow, partially you have an agent. So for example, 90% of the tickets in a customer support system can be sort of finished through a workflow, like you classify, retrieve, draft, send. So that could be like a very simple workflow. But if there are sort of edge cases where it doesn't fit in the traditional sort of the workflow solution mechanism, you have to sort of figure out like how do you sort of define an agent to get some of these answers. So this is like what I'm starting to see a lot, where you have a hybrid, where you have like a known um, set of questions being answered using like a structured workflow, but you sort of let certain edge cases, as long as it's like less of a risk, to automatically fix by an agent. So you'll see this very much involved in like different kinds of like tools. Like GitHub has these kind of tools where you have the initial sort of the solutions made by an agent, etc. So depending on that, you can sort of mix and match and create like this hybrid architecture that you may have the workflow, the structure from the workflow, and autonomy from the agents. So yeah. So I think like I promised Santiago about this. So like how to sort of decide between like building a work for an agent. So if you look at the first tier, which is like if the determinism is need to be high, and autonomy needs to be low, the risks are high and evaluations are high, workflows would be a great sort of solution. And the second one is like obviously you don't need to have a lot of determinism. You have that in loop. Because of that, you can have like high autonomy, risks are super low, and valuation, let's say medium. Agent is like a really good example. But if you think about these two, like where the determinism and autonomy is mixed, the risks are also mixed, and evaluation could be medium. In that case, you can look at some sort of hybrid sort of approach. So you have like both structure and the agentic behavior. So you see this with a lot of like tools where you have like this the structured data source, and you have SQL sort of to pull information from that, but you also have this agentic workflow on top of that to like do a lot more sort of um, unstructured evaluations on that data sets. So hybrid approach would be ideal for those kind of scenarios. So I think we are at the top of the 30 minutes mark, and I want to like yeah. So before we go into Q&A, just something to remember. Sort of common anti-patterns. So you shouldn't like start with like agent first architecture. You obviously should go with problem first and figure out like what is the ideal sort of way to solve this. And if you are building sort of agents, make sure to like have the like not to have like non-stop conditions. And the like there's no, if you don't have like LLM controls, like orchestration layer and the logic piece, that's also super bad. And I think probably 90% of the scenarios, like ideally, you might need to have a human fallback mechanism, especially like if you take like voice agent systems, things like that. There are like always the case, like you have like a human fallback if the agent can't handle it, and if the voice agent needs to sort of offload that to a human, uh, we need to do that. And then there's no eval. So it's super important that you have the right kind of evals in place, because like the more you sort of adjust the prompts, like when you iterate through the system, if you don't have the right kind of evals, you wouldn't know where the system would break, and it will break in production. Like, so it's super important you have the right kind of evals. Finally, like the rule to remember, like try first with workflow if you can solve the problem, and agents should be earned. And like, so to get to agents, like you should see autonomy will pay for itself. So unless you don't see that pattern happening, you should like jump into workflows. But there are like a lot of architectures and problem types where agents sort of fit in. So when you start building a lot more, you'll see similar patterns. But until that, I think like try with a workflow and start improving and see like if it makes sense to move to agent. Um, yeah, so I think like this is how to sort of think about choosing between agents versus workflow. And I want to like spend a bit of time if you guys have any questions. Feel free to use the chat as well or unmute yourself and ask questions. I'm happy to answer them. Cool. Yeah, okay. Think Manjusha Osha, the last was an example of for a workflow. I think like we looked at some of them. For example, this one where you have this pipeline that sort of extract information from sort of a document using OCR, and you go through this process where extraction and then the schema validation happens, and then you sort of store that information in the database. So that's like one sort of possible example. So I'll show like quickly like a work like agent. Let me see if I can. So this is like agent like I was just working on this week. So you probably wouldn't have like very specific path there, and depending on the question you ask, this is an agent to like do deep research on a topic and then go and save that in like Google Sheet as the database. So this is like a scenario where like it can take so many paths and you don't have like a very structured path there. So it decided by the prompt within the agent. So you have like a very detailed prompt inside, and then based on that prompt, it will decide which sub agent to go to and then sort of say that information. This is like an agentic sort of example where this one is a very structured output and we know the general workflow. Hope that answers the question, Manjusha.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool. Amazing. Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, thanks a lot, guys, for joining in. If you guys have any questions, like, yeah, feel free to reach out. I think me from my team share the LinkedIn as well, and we do have a WhatsApp group. We talk about AI in general, like any updates. So we sort of do a lot of work in this space in the industry because of that we see like different kinds of patterns and different kinds of architectures that are coming up. So we try to share them in the group as well. Feel free to join. So yeah, and thanks a lot for making the time to sort of join today and sort of asking the right questions. And looking forward to seeing you in another class in the future. Thanks, Santiago. Thank you.